Between 2015 and 2020, the European Union exported more than 81,000 tons of pesticides to Africa. Pesticides so dangerous, they are banned for use in Europe itself. And yet, these very same chemicals were shipped straight into African markets. Here, they were sprayed on our soils, handled by farmers without protection, and left to contaminate on our rivers and our food.
Between 2015 and 2020, more than 81,000 tons of pesticides were exported from Europe to Africa, chemicals so dangerous they were banned in Europe itself. Yet these same toxic products were shipped into African markets, sold to farmers with little warning, and sprayed onto fields with bare hands. Slowly, poison spread through African soil, rivers, and food, and it raises a disturbing question. If Europe considers these pesticides too deadly for its own people, why does it keep producing them, and why send them to Africa? The truth lies in a long history of exploitation, a history where fertilizers and pesticides first arrived on African shores, not to increase food security, but to maximize profits for colonial plantations. Today, that legacy continues under a new name, the so-called Green Energy Revolution. A global policy advertised as a solution to hunger, but one that locks African farmers into a cycle of dependency, debt, and destruction. Behind this system stand some of the world's most powerful figures, Bill Gates, and multinational giants like Monsanto, Bayer, and Syngenta, whose influence shapes the agricultural choices of entire nations. This documentary uncovers how Europe turned Africa into a dumping ground, how corporations turned farming into business, and how millions of lives are caught in a silent crisis hiding behind the promise of progress. To understand how this dangerous system began, how Europe still sends toxic pesticides and fertilizers to Africa, we have to go back to where the story truly starts, the colonial era. In those years, African land was not used to feed African families. It was seized, carved up, and transformed into massive plantations designed only to serve Europe's economy. Entire forests were cleared, local farming systems were pushed aside, and suddenly, Africa's richest lands were covered with cocoa, rubber, tea, coffee, cotton, and palm oil. But here is the truth that history often hides. None of these crops were grown for Africa. They were never meant to fill African kitchens or support African communities. These plantations existed for one purpose: to feed European factories and build European wealth. Africa provided the soil, the labor, and the resources, while Europe took the profit. And this colonial structure planted the first seeds of today's toxic dependency. As these plantations grew, the colonial governments began importing fertilizers and pesticides from Europe. These chemicals were not brought into Africa to support African farmers. No, they were brought in to guarantee that European plantations in Africa produced as much as possible. African laborers were forced to work long hours on these plantations, handling chemical products they did not understand, did not choose, and did not benefit from. The tragedy began when traditional African farming, methods that protected the soil, preserved biodiversity, and used natural pest control, was pushed aside. Europe wanted speed, bigger harvests, maximum exports, and chemicals became their shortcut. No one cared about what those chemicals would do to the soil, the rivers, or the environment. Slowly, something irreversible happened. African soil began losing its natural fertility. Each season required more chemicals than the last. Soon, the land could barely produce anything without fertilizers or pesticides imported from Europe. And farmers were trapped in a system where the only way to grow food was to rely on the very chemicals that were destroying their fields. But this was not a mistake. It was a strategy, one designed to keep Africa tied to European chemical companies long after the flags of independence were raised. Because once the soil is damaged and the ecosystem collapses, farmers have no choice but to keep buying the same products that caused the collapse in the first place. This is how Africa's chemical dependency was engineered during colonization, and why that dependency continues, silently and powerfully, to this very day. When African nations finally won their independence, many believed the continent would at last regain control over its land. But the reality was far more complicated. New leaders were immediately confronted with a critical question: how do we feed our people? Colonial rule had weakened traditional farming systems, replaced indigenous seeds, and left the soil dependent on chemicals to produce even the smallest harvest. Food shortages were rising, populations were growing, and governments were desperate. They needed fast answers. But in that desperation, a dangerous mistake was made. Instead of rebuilding the traditional African farming systems that had sustained communities for centuries, systems that protected soil, preserved seeds, and used nature to control pests, many leaders turned back to Europe for help. And Europe, along with North America, arrived with a grand promise, a sweeping policy called the Green Revolution. It was marketed as the magic solution to Africa's hunger crisis. But beneath that promise was a strategy that would pull African farming even deeper into chemical dependency and reshape the continent's agricultural future forever. The Green Revolution was sold as a miracle, an ambitious plan that, according to Europe and Western institutions, would finally end hunger in Africa. It promised higher food production, modern farming, and a future where African nations would finally become food secure. The formula seemed simple: new seeds, chemical fertilizers, and chemical pesticides. To newly independent African leaders, this sounded like the breakthrough they desperately needed, a modern solution for a modern challenge. So they embraced it, believing it would transform their nations. But hidden beneath this promise was a cost no one warned them about. African leaders did not see that the Green Revolution came with a new kind of dependency. By switching to European seeds, European fertilizers, and European pesticides, African countries unknowingly tied their entire food system to foreign corporations. Farmers could no longer save their own traditional seeds. The soil, already weakened, became addicted to chemical inputs and struggled to grow anything without them. And every planting season, African governments had no choice but to import more chemicals just to keep their farms alive. A miracle solution had quietly turned into a trap. The Green Revolution did not solve Africa's food crisis. Instead, it trapped the continent in a system where feeding millions depended entirely on products made in Europe. This was the birth of modern dependency, one that still shapes African agriculture today. Picture farmers in northern Ghana, families who had planted millet for generations, saving seeds from one season to the next. Their traditions included crop rotation, natural soil enrichment, and farming methods that kept the land healthy. These practices had fed African communities for centuries, but suddenly, they were told their ways were backward. They were told the future was modern farming, that innovation could let them plant all year round. So they were encouraged to abandon their own seeds and buy imported hybrid seeds instead. Seeds they could not reuse. Seeds that demanded fertilizers, pesticides, and a long list of chemicals just to grow properly. What looked like progress was actually a new kind of trap, one where African farmers were pushed toward tools they did not control and chemicals they would have to purchase every single year. A system designed not to strengthen African independence but to secure European profit. It looked like progress, new seeds, new technology, new hope, but quietly, African farming shifted from self-sufficiency to a buying cycle. Suddenly, every planting season required fresh seeds, seeds that farmers could no longer save or reproduce. And where did these seeds come from? Europe. Every time. If Africans had been taught how to produce their own hybrid seeds, that might have created independence. But that was never part of the plan. The plan was simple: create a system where Africans had to purchase, season after season, year after year, turning farming from a way of life into a permanent marketplace. And once the Green Revolution gained momentum, it opened the gates for some of the world's most powerful agricultural corporations. Giants like Monsanto, Bayer, and Syngenta flooded into Africa, seeing a continent with millions of farmers, vast land, and governments desperate for solutions. To them, Africa wasn't a region in need, it was a business opportunity. Use our seeds, use our fertilizers, use our chemicals. This is the only way to grow enough food. And just like that, Africa became the perfect customer. Monsanto and Bayer became the champions of hybrid seeds, seeds completely different from the traditional African varieties that farmers had saved and replanted for generations. Hybrid seeds could not be reused. Once harvested, they were useless for the next season. That meant every single year, farmers were forced to buy new seeds. And it didn't end there. These seeds performed well only when paired with chemical fertilizers and pesticides, all sold by the same corporations. A perfect business loop. If you buy the seeds, you must buy the chemicals. And once you buy the chemicals, you must keep buying the seeds. The cycle feeds itself, and it never ends. But hybrid seeds weren't the only trap. African farmers were soon told their traditional seeds were low quality, unproductive, and not modern enough. They were pressured to switch to certified seeds, seeds approved by governments and foreign institutions. Yet behind the labels, most of these certified seeds were owned by European and American companies. And to push this agenda even deeper into the continent, powerful global actors stepped onto the stage. One of the biggest among them was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whose influence would reshape Africa's farming future in ways many people still don't fully understand. Through a major initiative known as AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and its partners promised to modernize African agriculture. They poured money into programs that encouraged governments to adopt hybrid seeds, chemical fertilizers, and large-scale industrial farming. On the surface, AGRA claimed its mission was to end hunger. But beneath that promise, the initiative expanded the power of multinational corporations over African food systems. Trusting these promises, many African governments passed laws requiring farmers to use government-approved seeds. In some countries, farmers can even be fined or jailed for selling or exchanging their own traditional seeds. And that reveals a frightening truth. African farmers are slowly losing seed sovereignty, the basic right to plant, save, and share their own seeds. Today, millions of farmers across the continent cannot plant a single crop without buying seeds owned by foreign companies and chemicals produced in Europe or America. This is the opposite of how Africa farmed for thousands of years. It is an entirely new system, engineered by corporations and supported by billionaires, designed not to create independence, but dependence. A cycle where the soil, the seeds, and even the future of African agriculture are controlled from outside the continent. But even all of that was not the worst part. The real danger came from the chemicals themselves. European corporations began exporting pesticides to Africa, pesticides that were banned inside Europe. Between 2015 and 2020 alone, Europe shipped an estimated 81,000 tons of these toxic substances to the continent. These were not mild chemicals. Many were officially prohibited in the European Union because they cause cancer, pollute rivers, damage soil, and destroy ecosystems. European farmers are forbidden from using them, yet the same products that are too dangerous for Europeans are packaged, shipped, and sold across Africa. Why does this happen? Because European chemical companies earn massive profits selling products that African governments have not banned, and because they know many African farmers lack the training, information, and protective equipment needed to understand the danger. In Europe, farmers must wear heavy gloves, masks, boots, and full protective suits when handling such pesticides. But in Africa, these same chemicals are sprayed by farmers wearing everyday clothes, bare hands, no masks, no protection. The toxins sink into the soil, flow into streams and rivers, and linger in the food that ends up in African markets. A silent contamination that affects millions without them even knowing. Europe knows exactly what it's doing. The companies know it too. And yet the exports continue. This is modern dumping, sending dangerous chemicals to Africa simply because they cannot be sold at home. To make matters worse, many African farmers genuinely believe these products are helping them. They see fast growth, they see pests disappear, they see quick results. But what they do not see is the silent destruction happening beneath the surface, soil losing its natural fertility, plants becoming weaker, and farmers becoming trapped in a system where chemicals are the only way to grow anything at all. And once the soil is damaged, returning to traditional methods becomes nearly impossible. The cycle forces farmers to keep buying more fertilizers and more pesticides, most of them produced in Europe. This is how dependency is built, and this is how it is maintained. Europe continues to control African farming not through colonial armies, but through chemical supply chains. By exporting pesticides banned in their own countries, European corporations make billions while Africa pays the price through contaminated soil, declining health, poisoned water, and a weakened food system year after year. The pattern is unmistakable. Europe takes the profit, Africa takes the risk, and the cycle continues. The most frightening part of this entire system is that these corporations are protected, shielded by international laws and powerful institutions. This is why, despite countless warnings and rising concerns, almost nothing has changed. Behind every chemical exported to Africa, there are lobbyists, lawmakers, and institutions defending European corporate interests. These lobbyists fight for legal loopholes that benefit their companies, even when those laws damage communities far beyond Europe's borders. One of the biggest loopholes is simple but devastating. A chemical can be banned inside Europe, yet still be legally produced and exported to Africa. So companies claim they're following the law, all while shipping toxic products to places with weaker regulations. Another global force in this system is the World Trade Organization. Some of the WTO's trade rules make it extremely difficult for African governments to reject dangerous imports. If a country tries to ban harmful pesticides, chemical corporations can argue that the ban restricts trade, pressuring governments to reverse their decisions. This limits Africa's ability to protect its own people. Even international agricultural alliances, groups that claim to support African development, often push policies that benefit multinational corporations. On paper, these ideas look modern and efficient, but in practice, they keep Africa locked to foreign products and dependent on foreign control. At the same time, European governments rarely punish their own companies for the damage these chemicals cause overseas. It's as if the danger magically disappears the moment the products leave European soil. If African farmers fall sick, if rivers become polluted, if the land turns infertile, none of it appears in Europe's official reports. None of it counts. The reality is simple. Africa absorbs the cost, while European corporations collect the profit. And because these companies earn billions from exports, they use that money to shape global conversations about agriculture. They sponsor conferences, fund research, and support think tanks that repeat the same narrative. Africa needs more pesticides. Africa must modernize. Africa must adopt certified seeds. Messaging crafted not for African benefit, but for corporate profit. The result is a global system where Europe shields its own people from dangerous chemicals while defending the right to sell those same chemicals to Africa. A system built on profit over safety. A system where powerful corporations write the rules and Africa is expected to obey them. This cycle continues not by accident, but by design, maintained by a network of lobbyists, institutions, and political interests that ensure the flow of chemicals never stops. And now the question becomes unavoidable. How long will Africa allow this? If Europe protects its own people from these toxins, why shouldn't Africa demand the same protection for its own? The truth is, Africa does not need to remain chained to foreign seeds and foreign fertilizers. Long before colonial rule, African societies built sophisticated agricultural systems that fed entire populations without destroying the soil. These systems relied on natural fertilizers, seed preservation, mixed farming, and crop diversity, methods perfectly adapted to African climates and landscapes. It was the complete opposite of the chemical-heavy model later imposed by Europe. So if Africa is to escape this chemical trap, the continent must return to what has always worked. And that begins with 4 essential steps. First, protect local seed cultures. Across Africa, farmers have preserved seeds for generations. Resilient seeds, built by nature, free from patents and foreign control. These seeds are Africa's first line of independence. Second, invest in soil health rather than chemical dependency. Healthy soil does not need a constant drip of fertilizers. It can regenerate naturally through composting, crop rotation, and organic methods that repair the land instead of poisoning it. Countries like Rwanda and Ethiopia are already experimenting with these approaches, and the results are stronger, cleaner, and far more sustainable than anything imported from abroad. Third, Africa must build strong agricultural research institutions within the continent. For decades, farming policies have been shaped by foreign experts, foreign studies, and foreign agenda. But Africa has its own scientists, its own innovators, its own universities. People who understand the continent's soil, climate, and history better than anyone outside ever could. When African experts lead the conversation, the solutions finally match African realities, not foreign profits. And finally, governments must strengthen laws that block dangerous chemical imports. Some nations have already taken this bold step, banning pesticides that Europe refuses to use on its own farms. It's a powerful beginning, but it must be protected from pressure by multinational corporations and global trade organizations that fight to keep Africa dependent. Because breaking free requires more than policies. It requires a complete shift in mindset, the understanding that Africa does not need to look outside for answers. The continent already has everything it needs: fertile land, resilient farmers, centuries of agricultural wisdom, and a new generation determined to rebuild. When Africa regains control of its seeds, its soil, and its farming systems, it regains control of its future. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories like this.